And today I've got two foundational principles from the Revolution that are the backbone of the 10th Amendment to the Constitution for the United States. On this episode, I'm talking about sovereignty, or final authority of the people of the several states rather than final authority of government, and the right of resistance, keeping government in check without waiting on government to limit its own power. And with that, I want to start right into this with the text of the 10th Amendment. The power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Here's how James Madison described this set of delegated and reserved powers during the ratification debates in Federalist Paper number 45. He said, "The powers delegated by the Constitution to the federal government are few and defined by the proposed Constitution, of course, at that time. Those reserved to the states," he said, "or the people of the states, are numerous and indefinite." And in James Wilson's famous it should be famous because it was so influential on the ratification debates, the State House Yard speech of October 6, 1787, he described it this way. And this, mind you, this is before there was even a consideration of amendments. We know that John Hancock, shortly after the Philadelphia Convention was done, that was, of course, September 17, 1787, he started, in his own notes, drafting some proposed amendments, but there wasn't actually a push to have what became the 10th until a little bit later. Here's James Wilson describing the unamended proposed Constitution as well, just like James Madison did. "Congressional authority is to be collected not from tacit implication, not implied powers," he said, "but from the positive grant expressed in the instrument of the Union." So power in Congress, power in the federal government is not just, what we can squeeze out of it, but what has been expressly granted, positive grant in the instrument of the Union, that is the Constitution for the United States. Here's how Roger Sherman put it in a December 1787 letter, and this is a paraphrase, but he said, "The powers vested in the federal government are particularly defined." So it's expressly delegated, positive grant, particularly defined. Few and defined is how James Madison put it, so that each state retains its sovereignty. Now, rather than being an assertion of states' rights, as we're told to understand that phrase today, the 10th Amendment is actually what's called a legal rule of construction. The 10th Amendment, along with the 9th, tell us how to read the document. And James Madison explained this further in his famous, again, I'm using that term, report of 1800, explaining the Virginia resolutions of 1798 against the hated Alien and Sedition Acts of that year. And here's how he's describing how you're supposed to read the document, based, of course, on the original version of what he was talking about in Federalist 45, and then amended to hammer it home with the 9th and 10th Amendment. And he put it this way: "Whenever, therefore," we could call it Madison's two-step, I guess. "Whenever, therefore, a question arises concerning the constitutionality of a particular power." So if there's something that's being proposed, or something that they're doing, or something that they're trying to do, or whatever, if there's a question about, is this constitutional, this is how you do it, according to James Madison, the so-called father of the Constitution. He put it this way: "The first question is whether the power be expressed in the Constitution." The number one thing you have to ask. Is this constitutional? First look, is what they're doing listed out expressly in the Constitution? He says, if it be, the question is decided. Plain and simple. If they're establishing a post office and a post road, and now, just a quick aside, I always get off the track when I talk about post roads. Post roads, to the founding generation, the legal definition of a post road were kind of basically interstate highways, major thoroughfares that were marked by posts. They were not every single road that the mail traveled over. It was basically an interstate highway. So the idea that we have to also understand the words, how they were understood to mean at the time of ratification, that's a quick side note. But the first question, if it's expressly in the Constitution itself, then the question is decided. if it be not expressed, sometimes I stumble over the way they wrote back then, the next inquiry must be whether it is properly an incident to an express power and necessary to its execution. Madison here is talking about the well-understood legal doctrine of principles and incidents. This is the necessary and proper clause in Article 1 and Section 8, and we know everyone uses it to mean, the way they use it today is whatever they think is necessary and proper to do whatever the hell they want, they're going to do it. But principles and incidents were widely understood as a legal document, legal doctrine. That is, there's a principal power, so the power to establish a post office. You can't establish a post office if you can't basically staff it, or you can't actually lease or buy the land or get the building materials or do the things that are necessary and proper to its execution. It's a little bit more difficult. There's some gray area there. And of course, whenever there's gray area, politicians will expand their power. But if we actually use that doctrine as Madison understood it, it would be far different today. He says, if it be not expressed, the next inquiry must be whether it is properly an incident to an express power and necessary to its execution. If it be, it may be exercised by Congress. If it be not, Congress cannot exercise it. This is Madison explaining basically the two-step on how to read the Constitution. And of course, Thomas Jefferson considered the 10th Amendment to the foundation, considered the foundation of the Constitution. He said that specifically in his arguments against the constitutionality of the National Bank in February of 1791. February 15th, which is 10 months to the day before the 10th Amendment was even ratified. It was under consideration at that time. Here's how Jefferson put it. I consider the foundation of the Constitution is laid on this ground, that all powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states or to the people. Now, also, as Sherman noted, the 10th is also an affirmation of sovereignty of the people of the several states. Here's how Samuel Adams put it in a letter to Richard Henry Lee, August of 1789, where he's getting a little antsy because he promised the people, along with John Hancock in Massachusetts, that he would only be on board with ratification if they got a Bill of Rights. If they got, well, he didn't say it specifically, they wanted specific amendments. The first thing that they recommended in the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention in early 1788 is a precursor to what became the 10th. So Samuel Adams, here it is August of 1789, he's writing his good friend Richard Henry Lee in the Senate, and he says, hey, we got to get this done. And here's how he described it. There is a distinction between, and he wanted to see it specifically spelled out in the document with an amendment, that there was a distinction between the powers delegated to Congress or to the federal government and those reserved to the people of the several states. He says there is a distinction between the federal powers vested in Congress and the sovereign authority belonging to the several states. And here he also briefly lamented about an out-about face of one of their friends. He says, basically, you know, we've had kind of a loss of our former Republican friend from Connecticut. And I think he was actually talking about Roger Sherman. Anyways, before getting to a little further discussion about sovereignty, I should mention that all these source documents that I'm referencing, these original quotes, these letters, these papers, and the like, Federalist Papers, Report of 1800, Jefferson's arguments, etc., and basically everything else you need to follow the show, you can find on our show homepage over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. It's all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Of course, not only are you going to find the show notes for this particular episode, but you're also going to be able to find all the different platforms we're on. We live stream on the mainstream ones like YouTube and Facebook and Twitter and Twitch. We also live stream on the very important decentralized, censorship-resistant Odyssey.com, ODYSEE.com. I hope they make it. We archive our videos all over the place, so if you don't see us someplace, do let me know where you'd like us to be. We also have the podcast, the audio-only version, all over the place. Spotify, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts. Thank you for all the reviews coming in there. Podbean and elsewhere. And you can even find our membership program where you can put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month. We make it go a long, long way in support of the Constitution and liberty. And before getting back to that discussion on sovereignty, I do want to say hello and thank you to everyone for being here in the live stream. And whether you watch it live or you listen in the archive, whatever, I really appreciate it. But a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat. There's Liberty Revolutionary, Richard Banks, Cheriton Farmer in Missouri, Dixie Strong in Alabama, Dave Simmons, Tim Martin in Arizona, Sharon Patriot, Johnny Johnson, Haji in Oakland County, Michigan, Patricia Dance. And I like how Haji says, right of resistance, don't comply, nullify. And of course, we're going to get to that in just a moment. Clay Kent, happy Wednesday, Sharon Patriot. That Liberty Gal, DFW, right? Tyler B., Murray Ray, Merkin Muffley. Let's see if there's anybody else that I'm missing here. Erwin Havranek and everyone else. I apologize if I missed anybody. I will look a little bit later on the show if I have still some time left to see if I can answer some questions. Fuzz T. Fork, Donna Jane. I see a few others. Thank you so much for being here with me. Let's get back to this discussion on sovereignty. And I think sovereignty, well, first of all, sovereignty to the founding generation, sovereignty in the American system means final authority, final, above, there's no recourse on earth. And I consider sovereignty to be one of the foundational principles behind the revolution. Now, the revolution happened before the war commenced, as John Adams put it a bunch of times, for example, to Hezekiah Niles in a letter in 1818. The revolution was a change in the viewpoints, the political sentiments of the people. And one of those viewpoints that changed was an understanding of sovereignty. And I think we can mark James Otis Jr., his 1761 arguments against the writs of assistance as a big turning point, if not the top turning point in this understanding of who holds final authority. And one of the arguments that he made was an act against the Constitution is void. Now, if government has sovereignty, if government people hold final authority, it doesn't matter what you've written down. It doesn't matter if you've written down, you cannot cross this line ever, because government is sovereign. And therefore, if government says, well, we have an emergency power or whatever they want to say, then they're going to do what they want because government has final say over what the document means or what the rules mean. Here's how James Wilson put it. This is in the Pennsylvania Ratifying Convention. He described it very similar to this, and I'm not sure on the date. I've seen kind of conflicting dates. November 24, 1787 is how I have it listed and how they have it at Teaching American History, but I think they took a break and came back on the 26th. I don't know if you need to know that. Anyways, the message is what's important. James Wilson described it this way. The truth is, and this is carrying on the tradition of what James Otis Jr. said all the way back in 1761, the truth is that in our governments, the supreme, absolute, and uncontrollable power remains in the people. And they put remains in italics. I'm assuming that when he was speaking, he really highlighted that. It's not that they've given it away, or maybe they somehow got it, or now this government has it, or that government had it. As James Wilson's describing it, sovereignty, final authority, is in the hands of no government, state, federal, local, anywhere, any other government at all. It's always been with the people, and in the constitutional system, the people of the several states. It's always there. They're delegating a right to use some of that sovereign power to various governments as the people of each state determine, or under the Constitution as they ratified. He says, as our constitutions are superior to our legislatures, so the people are superior to our constitutions. And logically, I think that brings up a really important question. If government is going to be bound by a set of rules, so if we're going to give them a written constitution like we have today, or they have an unwritten constitution like they had in the time of James Otis in 1761, and if government doesn't have the final say over its own powers, then what's supposed to happen if government doesn't follow the rules? I know you guys are, I'm sure, unless you're brand new and you've never heard of our work or ever followed anything that we've done or anything that I've said, you know where I'm going with that. And for that, I think we should really go much further back then the early days, or what John Adams called the beginning of the controversy between the American colonies and the British Empire. That is James Otis's writs of assistance arguments in 1761. And I want to go back to Algernon Sidney, and let me see if I can pull this up here. I don't mention this guy enough. He was incredibly influential, basically the textbook of the Revolution, the principles and thoughts. That's how we can describe his work. He wrote in the 1680s. I don't know the exact date. He was killed in 1683 by government for merely writing a draft of a book called Discourses Concerning Government. Years later, Thomas Jefferson referenced that book in at least one letter that I know of, but I'm certain he referenced it a bunch of times because so many people talked about this in their library. Discourses Concerning Government, as this is how Thomas Jefferson put it, the best elementary book on the principles of government. So if you want to understand the principles of government according to Thomas Jefferson, this is your Government 101 book. Algernon Sidney's Discourses Concerning Government. They raided his house. They found these papers. He was talking about the evil of a sovereign king and things like that. And so he was arrested and he was killed in 1683. And the book wasn't even published until, I think, 1690 something, 1695 or 1698. And he was considered basically a martyr to the Republican cause, a martyr to liberty by the founding generation, basically the old revolutionaries. And here's one of the most important ones that we're getting to for today. Algernon Sidney said, "That which is not just is not law, and that which is not law ought not to be obeyed." So this is a serious precursor to 1761, an act against the Constitution is void, because if the act is void, it just flows logically that if they're doing something and this is void, then no one needs to follow it. And that really comes from this base understanding that if it's not just in the first place, and it is unjust if they're doing things outside of their delegated powers, if they're doing things outside of the rules given to them, the stuff that they're authorized to do in the Constitution, again, unwritten to James Otis Jr. and his generation, or written to us and the founding generation. That which is not just is not law, and that which is not law ought not to be obeyed. I have to keep repeating that one because it's so important. And that kind of message carried forward to the Revolution, the early days of the Revolution. Here, for example, Patrick Henry's resolutions, or Virginia Resolves, against the Stamp Act in March of 1765, and this is part of his "If This Be Treason" speech. He introduced these resolves to oppose the Stamp Act, and of course, we know a little bit of that history. And this is one of the resolutions that actually didn't pass, but they came from Patrick Henry, and they were republished all over the place. So they lit a fire under the Sons of Liberty in Boston and New York and elsewhere, and really became a foundational principle to resistance to the Stamp Act. And he said, "The inhabitants of this colony are not bound to yield obedience to any law or ordinance whatsoever designed to impose any taxation whatsoever upon them, under the laws and ordinances of the General Assembly aforesaid." This is a foundational principle of the 10th Amendment in and of itself, right from Patrick Henry. Maybe Patrick Henry really is our original 10ther, or James Otis Jr., if we think about it. Because if they're only authorized to do certain things in the Constitution, and if they try to engage in doing stuff that is not delegated to them, not authorized to them, that the only people who can do that are your local government assemblies, or maybe none at all, for example, then that's really the same thing that they put into the Constitution in amendment in the 10th. So Patrick Henry's basically saying, like, look, if they do stuff they're not authorized to do, because the local government is the only one that is authorized to do this, then no one is bound to yield obedience to them. And of course, that was considered very treasonous by some people. I did a whole episode on Patrick Henry's resolutions and speech against the Stamp Act. It was on his 29th birthday, May 29th, 1765. I will link to that episode in the show notes, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Again, it's all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. John Dickinson, the penman of the Revolution, carried forward with that same message. In the fall of 1765, I really think Patrick Henry was really the one who led the way on this. But here's how he put it in his broadside, urging people to resist. If you comply with the act by using stamped papers, you fix, you rivet perpetual chains upon your unhappy country. As soon as you comply with an act, then you're basically enforcing it for the government. There's no reason for them to do any enforcement if everyone just follows what government tells them to do. And that's what Dickinson recognized here in 1765. He says, you unnecessarily, you voluntarily establish the detestable precedent which those who have forged your fetters ardently wish for, to varnish the future exercise of this new claimed authority, to establish the principle that they're going to build upon this. And he was warning, like, even if you thought that the tax on stamped papers wasn't going to be a huge deal, he was warning, like, okay, as soon as you start out with this, there's going to be more and more and more and more. Compliance is violence is what I titled another episode, focusing heavily on Dickinson and the great Lysander Spooner in the 19th century. Anyways, John Hancock summed up this view, this spirit of resistance, just weeks before the Stamp Act was supposed to go into effect in November of 1765. This is a letter to his London agent, I believe Jonathan Bernard. He said, the people of this country will never be made slaves of by a submission to the damned act. So if they're not authorized to do something because the Constitution only allows them to do certain things, and again, we're talking about the unwritten British Constitution, if they're only authorized to do certain things, and sovereignty isn't with government but with the people, then the people can actually make that final decision of what's authorized or not. And if government still persists in doing stuff that they're not authorized to do, then the people, of course, have a duty to resist. They not only have a right, but a duty to resist. And here from the Declaration and Resolves of the First Continental Congress in 1774, they carried, this was actually one of the softer messages of the time, but it's kind of like, well, they listed a bunch of things specifically. They said, these are things that you guys have done, and they're very problematic. And they summed it up with this: to these grievous acts and measures, Americans cannot submit. Not that they shouldn't submit, they might not submit, but they absolutely cannot submit. Not only are you not authorized to do this stuff in the first place, but it's an attack on our liberty. I did an episode covering that particular document called An Early Bill of Rights, Declaration and Resolves of the First Continental Congress. I did that in October of 2020 now, almost closing in on 2 years ago. But this is why actually I love these old revolutionary episodes, because they explain to us the foundational principles and a lot of what's been missing, which is so many people just rely on getting government to do the right thing, waving a document at them, or getting the right people in office, or getting the right court case, the right words. And that is not the most essential part. Of course, that makes it more difficult for them. But without the people saying we will not submit, nothing changes. Again, if everyone submits, if everyone complies, there's no reason for government to stop doing what they're doing. And of course, there's no reason for them to stop doing even more. Now, this same principle where if they do stuff that they're not authorized to do, they should resist, the people should resist, was carried forward to the ratification debates. Again, even before the 10th Amendment was being proposed or considered, well, by this point, and I'm not sure if they would have known about this down in North Carolina, but I would think so, because of course in places like Massachusetts, they had already recommended, they said, we're going to ratify as long as we can get these types of amendments. And then again, the number one in Massachusetts was a precursor to the 10th Amendment. Here's James Iredell in the North Carolina ratifying convention in the summer of 1788 in July. He says, I guess it's the Hillsborough Convention, the people will resist if the government usurp powers not delegated to it. He was actually talking about, okay, we've got some concerns about ratification. I'm going to acknowledge you are correct, opposition, that government may not follow these rules. James Iredell ended up being, he's one of the top legal minds of the founding generation. He ended up being one of the first associate justices of the Supreme Court. He was nominated by President George Washington. And here's how he's describing it. He's like, look, abuse may happen in any government. This is going to happen. But, and of course, they had the experience of this against the British. What did the people do? They resisted. They resisted. They resisted. They asked. They resisted, petitioned, resisted, petitioned. And it was only when the opposition ramped things up, and we know this from the Declaration of Causes why they took up arms, Dickinson and Jefferson in July of 1775. The people took up arms because they were being attacked. They were taking up arms in defense. So the people will resist if the government usurp powers not delegated to it. That's pretty straightforward stuff. They don't make Supreme Court justices like they used to, do they? And here's George Nicholas at the Virginia Ratifying Convention a month earlier. He said, if they exceed these powers, same kind of message, if they exceed these powers, the people will have a right to declare it void. He didn't say if they exceed the powers delegated to them, the people will have a right to go to the federal government in order to get federal judges to declare federal power void. He said the people will have that right because the people hold that final authority. Theophilus Parsons up in the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention, he described it this way. An act of usurpation, so usurpation is an exercise of power not delegated. It's a theft of power. So if the people have sovereign authority, the people of the several states, and they delegated certain things to the general government in now Washington, D.C., and government does stuff that wasn't delegated to them, they're stealing power that doesn't belong to them. That's a usurpation. That was a serious term to the founding generation. And he says an act of usurpation is not obligatory. You don't have to follow this. It is not law. And any man may be justified in his resistance. And that was a very similar message to what James Madison said in Federalist Paper number 46, which if you follow our work at TAC, this is the one that we really base much of our work on today. His advice for individuals, cities, and states on how to defeat federal programs, a 4-step plan that did not rely on voting the bums out or suing in federal court or relying on the federal government to limit its own power in any way. I think the primary part of that is his recommendation of a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. Now, how you put this into practice, of course, how you actually not just blindly just resist and putting your neck on the line on every single issue really takes sound strategy. It takes a smart approach. And that's how Thomas Jefferson described it in a letter to James Madison, November 17th, 1798. That's a pretty big deal of a date because it was the day, the very day after the resolutions in Kentucky of 1798 were passed, signed by the governor, where Jefferson in his original draft said that whensoever they exercise a power not delegated to them, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. So here he is writing to James Madison. He's happy about passage of these resolutions against the Alien and Sedition Acts, and he says, I enclose you a copy of the draft of the Kentucky Resolves. I think we should distinctly affirm all the important principles they contain, so as to hold to that ground in the future, and leave the matter in such a train as that we may not be committed absolutely to push the matter to extremities, and yet may be free to push as far as events will render prudent. So you got to have smart strategy about how you respond to the largest government, the largest empire in the history of the world. But the fact of the matter is, at the end of the day, you're not supposed to be waiting for 2 or 4 or 6 years or forever for federal judges or federal politicians to magically limit federal power. It almost never happens. You're supposed to stand up, resist, refuse to comply, and nullify unconstitutional acts as they happen. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. More important than anything, I hope you learned something. I really appreciate you spending a little time with me today. I do actually have to run, so I'm going to look through the live chat a little bit later today. Please continue leaving comments, questions, thoughts, recommendations on this or for future episodes, whether in the chat on any of these platforms, or you can email team@10thamendmentcenter.com. Again, team@10thamendmentcenter.com. I read through all of it. I don't get a chance to reply to many of these, but your feedback tells me a ton. And speaking of feedback, you can help us spread the word by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform, that kind of stuff, along with smashing the like button on the video platforms, comments, subscribing, sharing links. All that stuff will trigger the algorithm of those platforms and tell them to show us to more people. It does help out a lot. We've been reaching more people than ever, almost every single month, slowly going up, but consistently, and I really appreciate your help. And as I mentioned earlier, our membership program, there is absolutely nothing that helps us reach and teach people about the Constitution and liberty and how to defend both in the face of a government that never, ever wants to follow or support either than the financial faith and support of our members. That is the number one way we get the information out to more people. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members, all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I really appreciate you being with me here for the episode with me today. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you're having a great day, and I'll see you on Friday here on the Path to Liberty.